Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm Risa Shimoda with the River Management Society and welcoming you to a conversation about local, state, and federal river managers working together. We have a very, very seasoned and experienced, well-perspectived group of panelists this afternoon, and we'll have them introduce themselves, but I'll just introduce myself. And Angie Furman. Angie, just want to wave. So Angie will be operating the slides, and she's the coordinator for the River Training Center. And this is what we're going to talk about today. How are river managers working together outside of their own jurisdictions, how that works, and how maybe we can work together, understand more to work better together. So I'll pass it on to Lelia Mellon.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lelia Mellon. I work for the National Park Service's Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, and we work with different groups on outdoor recreation and conservation. And so the River Management Society has asked me for the past year to help get this group up and running. So we're having these monthly calls and also looking for other needs that you all have for networking and supporting one another. So that's the real goal of this. And so let us know if you've got thoughts or ways you want to contribute. We'll be in touch more about that later, but we welcome today's speakers to come, and I think we're gonna let them introduce themselves. Is that right? Yeah. So we've got David Schade from Alaska, Liz Lacy from Massachusetts and Connecticut, and David Brown from Tennessee. And we're going to talk about federal, state, and nonprofit river management. And yeah, like I said, well, let's just start off. I think we're going to hold questions until the end, but do jot them down and remember what you wanted to ask. And we'll start with Dave and let him introduce himself.
Right, and you can also put your questions in chat. So I'm Dave Schade. I'm now the director of the Division of Agriculture for the state of Alaska. So what's an ag guy doing on rivers? Well, my first job was a river manager for the state 12 years ago. I did that for 4.5 years, and then I was the water section chief for 6.5 years, where I managed the use of water and hydrologists and dam safety programs for the state as well. So I come at this from a guy that started out floating down the rivers to now managing policy level stuff. So do you want to introduce everybody and then move forward? Is that what you want to do?
No, I think, no, just do yourself and then.
Go ahead. Yeah, sounds great. So let's go ahead and get started. So since I've been doing this for a while, a lot of times people ask me, what did I learn over the last 12 years on how to do this? And so, you know, I do want to say that these are suggestions, things that I've learned. I didn't learn it in day one. This is something that took a decade for me to figure out. So these are recommendations. We're going to go at the 50,000 foot level. A lot of these things we're going to talk about could be their own individual hour-long sessions. So what are the challenges of cooperative management? Well, first of all, I mean, let's talk about what are we dealing with. One, boundaries. What are the boundaries of this situation we're dealing with? Is it legal? Who owns the uplands? Who owns the riverbed, the submerged lands? Has there been a navigability determination? If we're in a hydrologic unit, what size is it? Are we on large scale? Are we on small scale? So the first thing you kind of got to look at is what are the boundaries and where are we kind of working this group? So if you have an unlimited scale, then you have unlimited solutions. If you can bring your scale down to where you have common issues, you know, that's a good start. Relationships, you know, what is your agency culture and how do they work within the agency and with outside agencies, and what are those cross-agency relationships? And if you don't have cross-agency relationships, that is something you have to do to have cooperative management. If you don't have the ability to pick up the phone or send an email and work with people that are also dealing with the same issues you are, well, that's going to be a little bit difficult. And the third thing is you have to acknowledge right up front that there are conflicting statutes, policies, and regulations that each of us operate under, and it's not personal. If you're coming in with a federal perspective, you have certain laws and regulations and policies, and sometimes they change. If we're in the political environment, sometimes those move a little bit. So, you know, it's not personal. This is one of those things you do it. And if you're down to the city level, then you're much more focused than the state or the federal level, which broadens out. Next slide. So, you know, one of the things that I have to sometimes remind my friends in the federal side is we operate under the theory of federalism. And what does that mean? It means we are supposed to be working together. And I put that down on the line. That is what we're supposed to do. The federal agencies are supposed to work with the states and local governments to make sure this is going to work on the ground, on the river. And so, you know, when I get somebody's responses, this is my gig and I don't have to listen, I will point out EO 13132 and say, well, I don't think you're starting from the right spot. So we talk about how that is, as it says there, national, state, local. We are a system that's supposed to work together. Next slide. So from the federal perspective, where are they coming from? And that's something that we all have to know is where are we each coming from? If you're, you know, these are just some of the big ticket statutes that a federal agency has to look at. Wild and Scenic, we talk about that a lot. But if you're a river manager, you might have Clean Water Act issues. You may have Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act issues, NEPA issues you got to deal with, contaminated sites. And we all, sooner or later, sometimes run into that Endangered Species Act. And I can guarantee you, when some of these federal statutes start impacting what you're doing, you're going to need to understand how that is, because sometimes those are going to be the primary concern, and that agency is going to have a lead, and they have strict requirements of what they have to do. So this is actually a slide I stole from a Jennifer Gardner, who was a deputy, principal deputy secretary at BLM on a national level conference. And this is exactly what we were talking about on water management, but it goes all the way down to the individual rivers. Next slide. Water rights. When we're talking about rivers and management issues, we need to understand that water rights are a key. And what is a water right? It's a legal right to use the surface or groundwater. And once beneficial use is established, the water right is certificated, only lost by non-use. Now, that is pretty set for a prior appropriation doctrine water right, and that is first and right and first in time. Now, you get east of the Mississippi River, you could be in the riparian doctrine, which is a use at location. Water rights can be one or two classes in and of themselves because it is state specific, based on federal law, then based on state law. A couple of things to remember about water rights, if you're even on the federal side, is water rights are adjudicated under the McCarran Amendment by each state. So you have a federal water right, that's fine, but if you haven't applied for it, you got to go to that state and work within that process there. There are some states that don't like to do that, so it can be challenging, but that's something whatever jurisdiction you're working in, you need to know that lay of that land, because that's going to impact what you do. And now more recently, in the last, 30 years or so, we have what we call in Alaska reservation water, more generally known as in-stream flow rights. And so almost every state is now looking at how do we balance the uses and keeping water in the stream so that it can be used. Next slide. So that leads down. Okay, what are our in-stream uses? What are our out-of-stream uses of the water? So in-stream, we need that water in the river or the lake to carry out the vital functions for ecosystems, fish and wildlife, recreation and aesthetics, navigation, huge deal. And sometimes remember, our rivers are international bodies that foreign countries have a right to deal with or go through. Alaska, Canadians have an international treaty right to go up the river to their country. So those are the kind of things that you need to know in that global perspective as you're managing what are some of those in-stream uses. And then of course you've got out-of-stream, and that's where people are using it for power generation. And we all talk a lot about dams and power generation, low head, big dams, all of those issues, many discussions on that. We look at domestic and industrial use, okay? If you don't have water in your city, there's a bunch of thirsty people, you got a big problem. That's something you have to deal with. Understand where those uses. Industrial includes agriculture. Agriculture uses a lot of water. And so those uses and those conflicts are something that you have to understand as you go through. As I said, irrigation, then you get into mining and you get recreation. You know, hey, are we making snow with that water? Is it groundwater? Is it surface water? Is it conjunctive management? Is it management that's separate? And so all of those different systems operate in different scales in different regions and by state. So that's where I suggest that when you come into a system is you start trying to figure out these higher level issues and start learning as you go, so that when you're having the discussion, you're well informed. Next slide. So current issues, you know, are we in a static situation? No, we're not. So, you know, climate change, people argue about climate change. I don't know. I say climate change is a change in weather patterns and water flows. In Alaska, we have the same, the hydrologist, I went and asked him, I said, so is there a different amount of water? Nope. Comes in different forms and at different times. Management regime, total change. So now what are we dealing with? We're dealing with drought and water use planning. On the other hand, we're dealing with floodplain management, water supply management, invasive species management, and then the use and or the overuse of rivers in the natural environment. And it's like people, California has one of the most interesting water management schemes, because on one hand, they're trying to have enough water for people to use for drinking. On the other hand, if they store too much, then they flood everybody out. So they literally on a day-to-day basis are trying to figure out what level is enough, but not too much. It's a headache I'm glad I don't have to do. So as we are looking at all the issues in the first part of the slide, then what are our conflicts? Okay, Clean Water Act definitions. WOTUS, that's an ongoing discussion, and it's going to be an ongoing discussion for another decade, in my opinion, because there's, you know, the Supreme Court clarified a couple things and made it clear as mud. So it's going to be a while longer before we figure out what is contiguous and things like that. And another thing that water managers and high-level people argue with, I mean, we can argue for days on that, just what should be the definition. Again, as I said earlier, you know, a McCarran Amendment says that adjudication is going to be in a state. What if you're in a state that decided they're not going to adjudicate federal water rights? I know one state that was the position they took. So then the feds have to use federal court, not state court, to go through that. And again, as we were talking, water storage and use, the different needs, and you have conflicts. You got somebody that says, I want the lake full for my fish, and I want to go fishing, and I want to go boating, and the guy's downstream going, but if you do that and we have a wet spring, I'm going to get flooded, so I want the lake low. Those as managers, those are those conflicts that we're always dealing with, is the balancing of uses, the balancing of the issues. And then a lot of things, one thing that I didn't even think about, and I'm in Alaska, I didn't think about international water management conflicts until I got into Western States Water Council. And then we were talking about the flow and the dams between the rivers that go in and out of Canada and the United States and Mexico, and who's holding the water and who's flooding who. Those are very intriguing and challenging issues because the State Department manages that. Who'd have thought? I wasn't even thinking about State Department until somebody said we'd close off a river going into Canada, and we got a phone call real fast. It's like, not your jurisdiction. So those are some of the current issues that as a river manager, you go, wow, all right, that's some big ticket items. So next slide. So how does that affect me? Well, you know, I'm talking at 50, 100,000 feet here. But if you take this and you boil it down and you boil it down, all of this framework is going to impact you at a city level. And it's things like, okay, we are now going to be a great city and we're going to stop runoff. And so we're going to do catchment systems and we're going to develop all these things to try to keep our water clean. It's a great idea. Everybody thought that was wonderful until they realized the unintended consequences is the river flows are now totally changed because it's infiltrating instead of going into the river, and all the water rights for the last 100 years has been based on the timing and the flows of the runoff. That's the kind of thing that when I first started my river management, didn't even consider. So what do I do? Well, how do I suggest you figure out and you move forward and not take the whole 10 years it took me to figure this out? So I said, step one, learn and develop an understanding of your laws and regulations regarding the rivers in your jurisdiction. If you don't know what your job is, then it's kind of hard to deal with all the other folks you're dealing with. And then you have to go and learn and understand the differences between these laws and regulations between all the agencies regarding your river. Because I can guarantee you, in almost every river, and I always never say never, so I'm careful with that, but there's going to be something that is a bit of a conflict. And then, something that this association and we really pride ourselves in is helping people understand how to be a scientific manager. So to do that, what do you have to do? You got to develop and collect the relevant data and put it in a usable form. So as a river manager, if you haven't pulled your data, if you don't know what your river's doing, if you don't know who's using your river, if you don't know where their conflicts are, then it's going to be hard for you to operate in that environment with all the other managers. So in short, in order to work well with other river managers, you have to be well informed about all aspects of the management of your river. So that is just a broad oversight, trying to keep it at 100,000 feet. When we get to the end, you're going to get a couple more examples that are a little more on the ground, and then we can have further discussion. So thanks for listening.
Awesome, Dave. Thank you so much. So now we're going to go to Lacy, who I'll let her explain who she is.
Great, thanks, Lilia. Thanks, Dave. That was way up high, and I am going to bring it way back down. I'm Liz Lacy, and I work with the National Park Service Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers program. I've been working with these partnership rivers for about 20 years now, believe it or not. And I've worked primarily on the Westfield River in Massachusetts, the Farmington River in Connecticut, now the 8 Mile, and I'm nurturing along a potential designation on the Housatonic in Connecticut. And the partnership wild and scenic rivers are really sort of a subset of the Wild and Scenic Rivers program nationwide. They're primarily rivers found on the East Coast, and they're primarily rivers found in areas with many jurisdictions, a patchwork of ownership, and not necessarily rivers that are found in big national parks or big federally owned areas. So the partnership part of it is really establishing a way to manage the rivers using all the various levels of folks who are in those river areas, anything from citizens, volunteers, to nonprofits, local governments, states, and other federal agencies. So we are like a huge collaboration on each of these partnership wild and scenic rivers. And one unique thing about the partnership rivers is that they all have worked together collaboratively right from the very start. Right when they start thinking about getting designated, they work on getting together a river management plan and other kind of documents that help guide them along in their work, even before they get designated. And that helps to establish sort of a guide map, some parameters for how they all work together. But it's wonderful to have this sort of larger, broader community that's working on these rivers. Each of them brings to it a very different level of understanding of the area. A lot of the local folks know the area like the back of their hand. They know some of the relationships that are going on the river. They, really have sort of a dedication that's a really different level. Even if you've worked in an area for a long time and feel dedicated, it's not like people who live right there. So we are super happy to have the local folks who understand the local regulations. A lot of times, where the real regulation comes to helping to protect the river corridor comes in local regulations. Then we have state players who understand the broad array of state ordinances and regulations that affect rivers as well. So as Dave was saying, you do have to understand the rules and regs for how your river is to be managed, but luckily with all these different partners coming to the table and working together, they all bring their expertise and their knowledge about the local and state and other kinds of regulations that are pertinent to the different areas. And so that is really the crux of working on Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers, is to develop these relationships with folks and to gain a really strong network where there are really strong roles for every different person who's involved, different agencies, everyone who's involved on the river. It makes everyone feel like they have a role to play and that they belong in that management scheme. Next slide. So challenges about working in that kind of a setting are that because all the land is not necessarily in a national park or in a big federally owned area, we have a lot of random ownership and what I like to call non-point source access. So that means that people are just sort of hopping on the river and in any place that they can. It's not necessarily a place where you can say, all right, we're going to have reservations here and permits across the board, and we're going to manage this in one management scheme. Maybe you have 4, 5, 8, 10 different towns that all have a different philosophy about how they want to regulate access to the river. And so therefore, we have to have really strong relationships with people who are managing within their towns or managing within state parks or whatever kind of access areas there are along the river. Those relationships are constantly changing because different players move in and out of the area. For instance, in these little towns, the players change on the local boards pretty frequently. Even within state agencies, people come and go. So we really have to keep very much working in a really dedicated way to continue to have that network and to know who we're working with to make sure that we can accomplish what we want to accomplish. In the previous slide, you saw a group of people who were the river stewards on the Upper Farmington Wild and Scenic River in Connecticut. And that whole program sort of illustrates this whole thing about they're a team of folks who are either hired or volunteers, and their whole job is really to be the eyes and ears for us out on the river, working with communities, working with potentially law enforcement, other things that come up, and that they are the ones who really work to keep that network, and in terms of the recreation that happens on the river in particular, that's sort of a very, very time intensive. It's a positive, and it's also, one of the bigger challenges for that group is to make sure that everybody's speaking to each other, that we're getting everybody playing together to try to make sure we're doing the best for the river. The other thing that's a challenge with multi-jurisdictional management and not owning all of the land is that there are a lot of people who are kind of reluctant to partner with the feds. We're seen as maybe coming in and not knowing the area, not really caring about the local approach to things, and so there's a whole lot of work that has to be done to make sure that we're not taking over. We don't want to take over, getting that message across to people. For some folks, they're very concerned that we're going to be telling them what they can do with their land, what they can't do with their land, where they can access the river and where they can't access the river. And so there's a lot of education that has to go on about, what our role really is and how we want this to happen, that we're doing things with our partners to set up a management scheme to protect the river and to protect the outstandingly remarkable values for which it was designated wild and scenic. And we're not really there to take land, to take over, to exert federal power over everything. And that's sometimes a challenge, but I'd say for the most part, I think people having seen wild and scenic somewhere nearby in the last quarter of a century or so, they have a feeling that maybe the feds aren't going to just swoop down and take their land. So maybe we're getting somewhere with that. But in any case, I think this is a really wonderful program, and we do have to deal with a lot of what Dave was talking about, all that substance, and to have the different levels to work with for various things that need to be managed. It's a very effective and certainly a rewarding place to be working. So I'll leave it at that. And if you have any questions or need me to clarify anything at the end, I will be happy to do so.
Wonderful. Thanks, Liz. So now we're going to go to Dave Brown in Tennessee, who has a wealth of history and knowledge behind him. So I'll let him introduce himself. And you're muted, Dave.
Sorry about that. I've been working with outfitters since 1980, representing various outfitter organizations. I spent most of my career at America Outdoors, which was a leading national association for outfitters, provided all types of outdoor recreation experiences, but it really originated from two river outfitting organizations. And when I stepped back and sort of entered semi-retirement about 4 or 5 years ago, some outfitters in Tennessee asked me to help them organize. And so I've been working with them and dealing with some state issues in Tennessee. I'd like to start by giving you a little bit of overview of the paddlecraft rental operations that we represent here in Tennessee. There's an impression that there's been this explosion in commercial activity, when in fact most of the growth has been in private recreational kayaking. The advent of these inexpensive recreational kayaks, as you have seen, probably on the roofs of, it seems like half the cars on the highway have a kayak on them. So that has been where most of the growth has been. There has been some moderate growth in commercial activity, certainly in the last 20 years or so, but recently it's been either moderate or flat. Last year saw an uptick primarily in weekday business. The folks I represent, couldn't really increase their daily capacity because there were no product available, no new boats. But weekday business was as strong as weekends, which was an unusual outcome. And we saw many new types of users come into the paddle sports, folks who had never participated in the past, and certainly an increase in different ethnic groups as well. In a sense, just as an aside, there was almost a sense of desperation by some of these folks who obviously had lost, were not in school or just needed an outlet. And so it was somewhat of a challenge to be operating in the environment where, you know, you had to deal with sanitation of equipment. And so some of the outfitters had to operate at a reduced capacity. And that is why you didn't see as much growth as you would have seen otherwise. But in our state, you know, it's not a huge industry. They're prominent on about 100 miles of rivers, and that compares to about 1,100 miles of stock trout stream and 800 miles of native streams. Now, there's paddling on more than 100 miles, but it's really just mostly prominent on about 100 miles of popular waterways. To give you an idea of sort of risk management issues, in 2020, there were 6 fatalities, paddle sports fatalities in the state. None were with commercial outfitters, and that's generally the way that it's not an uncommon outcome. Usually there are 5 or 6 fatalities, and they're usually private boaters not wearing the life jackets or sometimes kayak fishermen. And so there've been some recent controversy among paddle sports in Tennessee, in part because of user conflicts between some fishermen and the increase in paddlecraft use on popular fishing rivers. And so we're working through that and looking for ways to reduce some of those user conflicts. Next slide. But the management pressures are not, as I mentioned, just from the commercial segment. I went in Walmart here this past summer, and I was surprised to see an end cap where they were selling river tubes for $4.95. So that's an example, I think, of the diverse, and these folks obviously don't have a lot of experience. We did see a number of incidents where folks were putting on rivers at 4 o'clock in the afternoon for a 9-mile float. And so that's the kind of management challenge that I think results from, you know, some of this increased interest that occurred. One of the unique things in Tennessee is that we have the highest sales tax rate in the nation. That's the main source of revenue. So that makes it more difficult to add additional fees for, you know, to commercial operations and, you know, have them essentially survive. So we're working on some issues related to fees as well, and looking for a broader based way to support this access. As in the picture you see there, that's actually kayak fishermen. They line both sides of the road for a quarter of a mile. So that's not commercial use, but it gives you some idea of what we're dealing with. And they're motorized uses at this site as well. And so then you've got, you know, in addition to kayak fishermen, you've got the recreational paddlers who are also converging on this popular resource. But there are ways to deal with this. And for example, you can have kayak lanes adjacent to the boat ramp, but you need funding to develop those kayak lanes. And so that's what we're trying to work with to come up with a strategy to provide a broad base of support for the state agencies so that they can handle and adapt some of these resources, which were designed in the 50s, you know, before all of this use emerged. So we really need to update, and, you know, part of that access is provided by agencies that are traditionally supporting what I call hook and bullet activities, or fish and wildlife recreation. And so their strategic plans are not even designed to accommodate these non-fishing game activities. They allow them, but you know, they're not really established. The representation on the commissions is not what I think is adequate to represent those activities. And so that's another issue that we're hoping to focus some attention on. So
Oh, Dave, you got muted again.
Sorry. I don't know
There
what
you go.
happened. I personally like the model they use in Texas, where they take a portion of the sales tax and on non-fishing game sporting goods. You know, there are already excise taxes on fishing game, you know, fishing rods and fishing equipment and hunting equipment. So I'm not talking about that, but just taking a portion of the existing sales tax. Now that's not necessarily going to work politically, but if I had my choice, I would choose that option to provide support for these activities, non-fishing game activities. Some of the issues for commercial outfitters, it's similar to your jobs. Outfitting is a career. It's not a short-term venture. And very often it requires people to invest in facilities which require long-term permits. And I like the model of a performance-based renewal model, which gives an outfitter the assurance that if they perform adequately, protect the resource, that their investments will not be lost, you know, to some other way of issuing permits. We recently got into a situation where companies that have been in business for 40 plus years, and they actually business predated the establishment of a state park. The park tried to, state parks tried to push through a proposal that when they limited the number of commercial use authorizations, at this is state level, not Park Service, they would issue them randomly or draw straws. Well, that didn't go over so well. So for somebody that's been in business 40 years, and they had to withdraw the rule eventually. And part of the problem was there wasn't really adequate communication about that rule. We just learned about it, 2 days before it went up for approval at a government operations committee. So, communication, I think, is really key to we weren't opposed to the commercial use authorization, but the way it was being implemented was problematic for us. Most of these businesses have negative cash flow for 7 to 8 months per year. And, what amazes me is how their survivability, because we have folks who, if they lose 2 or 3 key weekends in the summer to high water, that's their profit. They're gone. I mean, so they don't have, and they have to have money to get through the off season to buy equipment and replace equipment. So it can be a challenge at times, especially related to weather events. This year, for example, on the Harpeth, floods early season had resulted in 2 trees being down both sides of the river. And if you're in the river business, those are strainers and present risk to paddlers. And so the outfitters had to stop operating up there. And that focused more use in 1 or 2 access points. And so there were times when state parks posted on their Facebook page that basically they were full. They couldn't accommodate any more use. And they actually called the outfitters and asked them not to bring paddlers down to the river that day, which they agreed to do. But so it can be a challenge at times in operating. But I do want to say that our folks really appreciate most of the park people at the local level. And this is true both at the federal level and the park level. Some of these folks, the challenges because it's your agency and dealing with funding and use pressures. I've just seen some career Forest Service people who were just amazing at the job they did and how they adapted to different types of issues, just really creative. So our folks support reasonable regulations. We're not opposed to those. So, but again, communication is one of the keys. The next slide. Is that it? Am I done? Oh, there it is. So I think that's pretty much my presentation. Again, I want to just stress that we're all in this business because we appreciate rivers, and certainly the recreational access that you have facilitated. I just want to thank you for that and for the jobs you're doing, juggling so many balls, as Dave's presentation indicated. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, we didn't encourage you to put questions in the chat, so feel free to unmute yourself. And if you would like to put something in the chat, if you're feeling shy, you can feel free to do that. So our presentations were very different. Thank you, Dave and Liz and David, for your different perspectives. And I think, you know, we're concluding that we're all in this together, so we need to do our homework and know our data, and also appreciate the potential for partners and the importance of the others who are using the rivers, because our motivations are slightly different, but we are all in this together. Any questions or thoughts or anything that you'd like to share about anything that you've heard today? Feel free.
Well, I don't want to jump over anybody, but so, oh, okay. But I have just a thought. You all talked about the youth conflicts, and especially given the past year of how we have a whole lot of new and different users. And Dave Brown, you talked about it sort of from the outfitter's perspective, which is really interesting, and how, I don't know how you even deal with the fact if they're told not to come down because the river's full, but that's their business. That's a wild one. But from all the past almost year of conversations, I think it's been concluded that we had so much more use in 2020, which for the most part is a great thing. It's not going to go away. People have discovered the water, and it's a great thing. So how do we handle going forward with users, both from the safety and the capacity issues, conflicts? I mean, that's a huge question, but it's just overriding a lot of stuff.
If I could offer one perspective, you know, you do have some user conflicts, especially where you have fishermen and paddlers. And if you've got fly fishermen that are, you know, casting, they don't want to have to stop every time somebody paddles by them. So, you know, you could have 100 paddlers, and that would be too many for some folks. But we've seen some situations where you were able to, for example, fishermen generally like early morning, afternoon, you know, time frames, not so much middle of the day. And so where you do have those kind of situations, you basically do some time management and say, okay, you know, if you're paddling, you know, you put on after a certain time. Now, it's easier to control outfitters than it is the general public, because most of these resources don't have somebody at the gate. But, you know, certainly the outfitted element of it would be amenable to that kind of sharing, time sharing situation.
So I just want to hop in here for a second, if it's okay, and say that is actually one of the huge challenge on partnership rivers with the, you know, where there aren't gates necessarily, where there aren't areas where you can tell people it's full, you can't get on. They're just gonna come. And so there's a real challenge to like be out there on the river, doing some public education, working with the towns and with whoever is really in charge of potential parking areas, potential recreation areas, and you know, and to have a way to communicate and have a good relationship with everybody. I mean, it remains to be seen. 2020, like you said, Lelia, was a hugely challenging year. And a lot of us are now working behind the scenes with all of our different partners to see how we can handle this coming season. Coming up with some guidance to hand out to river managers in various places. but it's not always so much about the conflict of use, which of course happens, but the biggest thing is like parking. The picture that you showed, David, of you know, the parking up and down an access area. And then those tubes that people buy at Walmart and they just take the box and chuck it when they get out of their car. All those things, it just adds up and the volume is just huge. And so it's an ongoing, evolving approach. You can do all the planning you want in the world, but when it comes down to on the ground, actually dealing with what's really a crisis of use in a way, you know, we really have to work together and really band together and try to educate people. And so that's what a lot, I know at least on the Farmington, there's a public education campaign that's going to be starting this spring to really try to address getting people before they even get to the river.
David, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Your rivers, some of them are managed by the state and some of them are managed by a federal agency, Forest Service, and like the Ocoee, the one I'm familiar with, is partly state and partly the Forest Service. In your experience, do outfitters have different levels of enjoyment, angst, or feeling about working with the state versus federal, one being more difficult than the other, or one being easier, or no difference? Depends on the river.
Well, generally, state agencies are a little easier to work with because they don't have NEPA to deal with. For example, if you want a permit, you know, we have people that were running river trips and they want to take their customers on a short hike to a waterfall adjacent to the river, 100 people a year. They have to go through a permitting process, which may include NEPA. And somebody, you know, that's a very involved process, complicated. So from the standpoint of the hoops you have to jump through, it's easier generally to work with states. Now, there were some exceptions. I'd say BLM has been, our folks generally felt like BLM was fairly easy to work with. And then the National Park Service actually has their commercial use authorization was a fairly straightforward, easy to obtain authorization, but it was only for 2 years. So maximum term. So you really couldn't afford to invest a lot in that, you know, in an opera. Although people do, there are parks where people have operated year after year on CUAs, but it's not the long-term type of authorization that you really need to invest significantly. Forest Service is for some reason more complex than all the other agencies, and not trying to criticize Forest Service, but it just seems to be under the microscope more than you know, an agency like BLM or state agency.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting. Well, any other questions or comments or panelists, things you want to share? We can begin to wrap up here, I guess. So Angie, I think you were going to talk a little bit about RMS, and Lily was going to talk about our group here.
Yeah, Lilia, feel free to go first.
Okay.
Now you're muted, Lilia.
Thank you. So this group, as I said, we've been going for almost a year on these monthly calls, and we so thank our speakers each month. They've been fabulous. So moving forward, we are going to continue this. And in April, we're encouraging everyone to come to the RMS Symposium, which I think Angie's going to talk about in a second. But then in May, we're going to actually do 2 calls for a few months. And it's because we started on this river management theme, trying to network with the state agencies and locals and everybody else on their issues that resonate with them the most and have caused them trouble. So Dave Brown mentioned, you know, access points and how do you fund them? That was a topic we had one month, and I know it's a big issue. And we will continue to keep thinking about that. But we also, 9 months or so ago, said, oh, we would really like to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion on, in, around rivers, and how we make sure that we are trying to include as many people as possible. And some of that goes back to what you guys actually mentioned today, that a lot of these new users might not know either the etiquette or safety precautions around rivers. So we can now talk about this again. We had a little bit of a gag order for 6 months maybe, and we couldn't talk about it. So we're back, and we're gonna refresh ourselves by having 2 different calls in May, June, and I think July, trying to get that topic back up and running, but also keeping with more traditional river management topics. So in May, like I said, our classic is the second Tuesday of the month. The May topic is going to be messaging for river users who ignore signs and drown. How's that for? We're trying to hit you over the head and make sure you understand, or really, how do we learn how to get that safety message out there to folks? And then the second topic in May, which I think we're saying 4th Tuesday, is going to be around how cultures form, the importance of perspective of that, and then just trying to look at how we evolve differently and how that affects us in our day-to-day lives. So these should be interesting topics, we think, and we hope you agree. So we hope you'll join us. And then the other, what you see on the slide here, is that we'd started talking about this as a state river management group, but we weren't trying to have it be exclusive just to state agencies. So we polled people who had been coming to these and said, what name should we use? Because we want to make sure we're inclusive. And the votes came up with being a new name of River Management Roundtable. So that's what we're going to call ourselves. And I think those bullets say just what I just said, which is good. We hope you'll join us, and then also keep giving us ideas of what you want to talk about, what's important to you, and that you want a group to help think through or hash out ideas, etc. Anything else, Risa?
No, but go ahead, David. David's waving at us.
Yeah, on that topic, there was a great America Outdoors Act. We got huge pots of money sitting out there now. I'm not clear on how that's going to be distributed. Now, it can be used for maintenance and for access, I presume access, but it would be great to have somebody talk about where that money's going, how you can access it, or what the programs are going to be to distribute that money for especially for, say, something like river access.
Super.
That's a great point. I know land and water conservation funds often go into the state park plan, the SCORPS, and those programs rarely have water mentioned. So I'm completely biased, of course, but I think that's a really good conversation to have, because now is the time to try to get a handle on it. That would be a good topic.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Yeah. Okay.
I guess just before we close things out today, I just wanted to remind everyone that we've got the River Management Symposium coming up in April. It's going to be, we've got our pre-workshop or pre-symposium day on Monday, and then we're holding the main sessions Tuesday through Thursday. We've got a ton of great speakers and presentations lined up, some really good keynotes. We do have some of the presentations listed as training. We just wanted to let everyone know we've got a couple in DOI talent. So if anyone wants that on their DOI talent training record, that is available. If you'd like more information, you can feel free to email me, Angie at river-management.org, and I can send this over to you. We also are offering distance learning credits through American Trails. So yeah, and we've got a silent auction. We've got virtual field trips. It's going to be awesome. So encouraging everyone to go to the RMS website and check it out and register if you haven't already. And I think that's it from me. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add or any last questions that came up.
I'd just like to thank everyone again. If you're still here from the beginning of the hour, thanks for joining us. Thank you, David, a million. Thank you, Liz, a million. Thank you, David Schade, a million. And thank you for our members and those who are here just to enjoy. And like I said at the beginning, we have these conversations and they're meant to be information sharing, less a webinar and more, sharing your thoughts. Because I think if RMS has one great strength, it's that we're sort of a neutral forum for those who are working on rivers who may not work with each other. And there's opportunity, I think, that's very unique to reach out across the silos of our respective organizations to even fuss at each other, because sometimes that's important to do as well. And then Angie just mentioned something I forgot to say earlier, that we have been recording this. We'll finish that in a second, and we'll post the recording on the River Training Center channel. So all of our monthly conversations are posted there. So thanks for joining us, everybody.
Yeah. Annie, we've got